we'll get started here. As you're eating, you can continue. If you're in line, go right ahead. We're going to start, though, for the sake of time. And then once we get going here in about 25 minutes or so, we will open it up to questions. There'll be a microphone right here, and I think a second one being set up. You can actually come up, jump in line, and you can ask your questions to our fantastic panel. My name is Ben Swann, and I want to introduce the panel to you. Beginning here to my left is Ed Hudgins. He has provided me with an extremely long bio, so I will shorten it just a bit, Ed, if that's okay, or whoever did. Ed's an impressive guy. He has a lot going on. So let me tell you a little bit about him. He is formerly the Director of Regulatory Studies for the Cato Institute, editor of Regulation Magazine, an expert on the regulation of space and transportation, pharmaceuticals, and labor. Ed's opinion writing has been published in the Wall Street Journal, Houston Chronicle, USA Today, et cetera, et cetera. Goes on from there. In addition to that, he is the best-selling author of The Republican Party's Civil War, Will Freedom Win? I know you guys all have a copy of this book. It's an Amazon.com bestseller published by the Atlas Society, and it is a fantastic book. I hope that you will check it out if you have not yet. He's the editor of Freedom to Trade, Refuting the New Protectionism, Space, The Free Market Frontier, and 2 books on the Postal Service privatization. You monster.
Lost in the mail.
You monster. So we're excited to have Ed with us. Will you welcome Ed, please?
Okay. Thanks. Thank you, folks. And thank you all for coming. And let me go ahead and get my thing on here. Okay. I'm going to be hopefully brief about my thesis that's in the book. And the thesis is this. The Republican Party, the GOP, is in a 3-way civil war. Many people want to make it a 2-way dispute, but it's really a 3-way dispute. You have 3 factions within the Republican Party. First, you have establishment Republicans. These would be the type like Boehner, Mitt Romney, John McCain. And what they want to do is to keep the welfare state, tweak it a little bit, make it work a little bit better, but not challenge the fundamentals of the regime. And you often will hear them say, we want to save Social Security, we want to save Medicare and Medicaid, we don't want to destroy it, we just want to make it work a little bit better. Some of them do this because they fundamentally believe in the premises of the welfare state. Some believe this because while they might say we'd like to have a system that's better, we'd like to have a complete free market system, it's politically impractical. And so the best we can hope for is to make some changes that'll make the system work a little bit better. That's the best we can do. Those are the establishment Republicans. Second, you have the extreme social conservatives. These folks give priority to social issues and getting the government involved in social issues. Obviously, gay marriage is one of these issues, abortion, these kinds of things. They would be represented by Rick Santorum, Mike Huckabee, folks like that. Now, what's unfortunate is that some of these folks are not even good free marketeers. If you look at the record, for example, of Huckabee and Santorum, you find that in the name of family values, they often support status systems, or they often say, well, we want the welfare state or the tax system to favor families and not and so forth. By the way, I have twins myself. As you know, Aaron has twins. There may be a few of you in the room who have not seen the hundreds of pictures of my kids, and please feel free to come up afterwards and I'll show them to you. I'm a family values objectivist, okay? But what I object to is that the government trying to run my family. Third faction is what I call the libertarian, traditionalist, conservative, Reagan-Goldwater Republicans. These are the folks who understand that the system fundamentally is broken, that it is going to collapse, a la Western Europe. It's just that it's going to collapse perhaps slower if the establishment Republicans get their way, but they understand and they think the goal should be fundamental change of the system in this country. Now, I want to put this three-way civil war within the Republican Party in context. The GOP is in a demographic death spiral. If you look at for example, the GOP, you find that white evangelicals constitute the biggest single portion of GOP voters. But as a percentage of the population, they're going down. If you take a look at Hispanics, I'm not talking, by the way, about illegals. I'm talking about Hispanic American citizens who can vote. Right now, they make up 17% of the population. By 2050, they're going to make up 30% of the population. George W. Bush got 44% of their vote. Mitt Romney got 27% of their vote. You can see the Republicans are getting a smaller percentage of a growing demographic. Young people, same sort of thing. They're going to be the voters of the future, and the more they vote for one party, the more they get comfortable with it. Bush got 43% of their vote. Romney got 37%. It's been going down, and you can look at other groups as well. Now, what I'm arguing is that political parties go through realignments. They go through changes periodically. One happened within the late 70s and early 80s as a lot of conservative Democrats switched over to the GOP. I won't go over the whole history of the Republican Party, but I maintain that that is what has to happen. If not only the GOP is to survive and win elections, I do think they're going to probably pick up the Senate in the fall, but if they're going to do what they should be doing, and that is to restore freedom to this country. Because I'm not concerned particularly about any political party. I actually have a chapter on the Libertarian Party in my book. So what I'm arguing is this, that the Republican Party, that the true limited government Republicans have to lead the way, and they have to appeal to their constituents, their fellow Republicans. I point out that within what I call the limited government faction of the Republican Party, there are social conservatives. This is important to know. Dave Bratt, who just knocked off Cantor, is a social conservative. But here's the point. He gave priority to focusing on the need to limit government, to restore free markets, to reduce the size and scope of government. He didn't give up his social views. We would have differences, but he gave priority to limiting government. And I think that's a good thing. And I would appeal to all social conservatives that way. And I would say to social conservatives, if you don't do that, the state is going to continue to expand. Wait till they go after education and homeschooling. You see what they're trying to do with Common Core. Do you think they're going to leave you alone? Do you think they're going to leave us alone? You've got to give priority to reducing government. To establishment Republicans, I say, you're part of the problem. Many of you don't like the current system, but you say, what is the alternative? But if you don't challenge the system, there never will be an alternative. I say to the limited government libertarian Republicans, you guys have to understand that it took decades to get into the mess that we're in today, and it's going to take us a little time to work our way out. I would love to snap my fingers and make the welfare state go away, but I can't. So please recognize that once someone is elected, first of all, they have to get elected. You know, it's not a matter of making a great speech that gets applause in this room. It's a matter of going out and actually getting elected not only to Congress, but to local office, governor, state senator, state representative, etc. It means making political alliances, which means you're probably not going to get everything you want. But I think libertarians and traditional, free market Republicans have to recognize that as well. All the groups have to recognize how they have to come together behind a freedom agenda. I want to close with this. I've said this Republican Party is in a civil war. The country is in a civil war. It's a civil war between the makers and the takers, between the producers and the expropriators. We're becoming more and more a polarized society with some groups, that is the people who are producing things, whether it's an entrepreneur or a janitor or anyone in between, with the people who make money because the government grants them favors. Again, whether it's a union gets a special favor, whether it's a Wall Street bank that gets a special favor, whether it's an auto company that gets a special favor, you name it. That's what kind of society we're becoming. The moral foundations of the society are being eroded. And so that's the context of this three-way civil war, and why Republicans and Friends of Freedom have to come together behind the freedom agenda. I thank you for your attention, and go on to the other speakers.
Thank you, Ed. And so as we move over Shannon McGinley is a conservative activist. She's based in Bedford, New Hampshire, and has served as board chair of Cornerstone Action and Cornerstone Policy Research. Shannon?
Great, thanks, Ben. So I like to think of, is this on?
Is it on?
I think it is.
Is it on?
Just lean
Okay.
into it.
Yeah.
I'd like to think of society as needing 3 pillars in order for the government to remain limited, as Ed was talking about. And I think of these pillars as sort of being those guiding principles that creates a balance for individuals and society as a whole. And even at the smallest level of government, we have a form of government that has to exist, whether it's defined as our communities or even within our family, because it provides social order. And when Thomas Jefferson in the Declaration of Independence talks about certain unalienable rights, which were endowed by our Creator, what did he mean by unalienable rights? And those are fixed rights that are endowed by our Creator. And the reason why there's the emphasis on Creator is because it's a constant. It's never changing. We receive them from our Creator that no one else can take away from us. And they're endowed by them because the rights are inseparable from us. They are a part of our humanity. And the government, therefore, cannot take them away, but the government still, of course, tries to restrain them. So nations that are absent of this external force, they'll default to the state providing meaning for them. So I would argue that it actually expands government to not embrace that we are endowed with these inalienable rights from our Creator. So when we think about the words in the Declaration of Independence, if we say, yeah, well, they really don't come from a Creator, then where do they come from? Then we look to the state to give us those rights, and whoever is in power. And we all know what happens when our rights come from whoever is in power. We have ample examples throughout human history that tell us what happens in those particular situations. The second pillar is the pillar of life, because without the right to life, no other rights can exist, right? It's the most basic. And allowing individuals to arbitrarily define when human life begins leads to human rights abuses across the board. Anyone who advocates for any kind of government, no matter how minimal, should support making abortion a criminal act. If you advocate small government, you must assign limits to it, have limits its goals. What are the most basic reasons for government to exist? To keep people safe from outside aggressors or from each other. Objectivism, for example, argues for a night watchman. Government, basically the military, police, and the courts. The military defends the people from outside aggressors, and the police arrest and incarcerate the criminals, and the courts decide guilt or innocence and hand down those sentences. Liberalism is based largely on the non-aggression principle, which says, to put it very simply, it's morally wrong to initiate aggression. Force is justified only when combating force. And abortion violates the non-aggression principle because it allows for the unprovoked violence against another individual. For example, injecting potassium chloride into the heart of an unborn child in order to cause a heart attack, or ripping his arms and legs apart from his body, or sticking scissors in the back of his head and suck the brains out in order for him to die, I say is certainly an aggressive act. But of course, no one really wants to talk about how that's done. Abortion advocates also view the unborn as merely property to women. Certainly, we know of the history of the Dred Scott decision when we define African Americans as being the property of another, and what happened with that. Some governments can even argue that their land is their property and be able to use genocide to protect against those who they deem unworthy of human rights. Libertarianism also firmly is based on the belief of personal responsibility. If every man is and should be free to make his own decisions, it follows that every man must own the results of those decisions, the consequences of those decisions. So, for example, when a man and a woman choose to have sex, they are taking on the chance that they might produce a child, and therefore being responsible for the raising of that child. Furthermore, the abortion industry is a status, crony corporatist construct, if ever there was one. So while Planned Parenthood CEO is making 3-digit salaries, and we're giving millions of our dollars, of federal dollars, to Planned Parenthood, none of us have a say in that. And yet, where does the money come from? All of us. No matter what your feelings are on Planned Parenthood, the U.S. government is taking money from you and giving it to them, and we have no say in it. That's stealing no matter how you slice it. Of course, Planned Parenthood argues that none of the funds are used for abortion. However, we know that if they are provided funds for their other activities, it frees up dollars for them to use as abortion. And we're paying for the overhead of their facilities. We're paying for the air conditioning. We're paying for the internet access. We're paying for the landscaping of their property, which then helps to support their abortion business as well. But of course, Planned Parenthood doesn't ever want to talk about that side of it. So another piece of the pro-life point, too, that I want to make is that I believe that abortion actually undermines the rights of women. It treats women as an object in order to be made the same as men, that they can't have children, that in the workplace, that the children would be a burden. Women who have abortions because they feel like they have no other choice. They feel like they're a dog caught in a trap who gnaws off his own leg in order to break free. And I believe that as a society, we can do better than abortion and that we should love them both. And to help those things that are going on in her life, not by the government, but by our friends and our neighbors and our family, to help her with those issues that are going on in her life that are leading her to make such a drastic decision. Ron Paul once said, "Life begins at conception." That's not a political statement, that's a biological fact. And then again in 1999, in his speech to Congress, he said, "I'm strongly pro-life. I think that one of the most disastrous rulings of this century was Roe versus Wade. I do believe in the slippery slope theory. I believe that if people are careless and casual about life at the beginning of life, we will be careless and casual about life at the end. Abortion leads to euthanasia. I believe that," end quote. And then again, he said, when he was asked at a presidential debate, what will you do to restore the legal rights of the unborn? He said, "As an OB doctor for 30 years, I have delivered 4,000 babies. I can assure you that life begins at conception. I'm legally responsible for the unborn, no matter what I do. So there's a legal life there. The unborn has inheritance rights, and if there's an injury or a killing, there's a legal entity, and there's no doubt about it." And then on Senator Rand Paul's website, he says, "I'm 100% pro-life. I believe that life begins at conception and that abortion takes the life of an innocent human being. It is our duty in our government to protect this life as a guaranteed under the Constitution. If government has any function at all, it should be in protecting the most innocent citizens from the tyranny of abortion." And the last pillar that I want to bring up is marriage. In the debate over marriage, I find it interesting that the debate seems to focus only on the rights of adults, and nowhere is the discussion made about the rights of children and what is best for those children. Don't those children, they deserve to have their liberties and rights defended because they can't do it for themselves. Children have a right to a mother and a father. Their welfare is critical to advancing civilization. So marriage has two purposes. It has a private purpose and a public purpose. The private purpose may be for very personal reasons. It may be because you want to spend the rest of your life with this person. Maybe it's because you want to get out of your parents' house. Or maybe it's because you want to be able to wear a beautiful white dress and live that fairy tale wedding. All of these private purposes, though, never add up to the public purpose of the social institution of marriage. The essential public purpose of marriage is to attach mothers and fathers to their children and to one another. The purpose is essential, and if we don't get that job done, we wouldn't need marriage at all. Marriage is adult society's institutional structure for protecting the interests of children. Not all marriages have children, but all children have parents. Biology is how we define parenthood. What about adoption, you ask? Well, adoption exists to deal with the exceptional situations. It's giving children something they need, parents. It's a child-centered exception. It doesn't exist to give adults the children that they want. It is structured not to undermine the biological principle. They have to surrender their parents' rights, the parental rights, and the same exact rights are reassigned to the adoptive parents. The idea that the biology of parenthood is unimportant is at the core of redefining marriage. Redefining parenthood. Biology will not be the principle of parenting. There's no way that we'll be able to stop triple parenting as a result. A third party always has to be introduced because two women nor two men can make a baby. The state will have to determine who the parents will be. The power of the state will be expanded. Parenthood is becoming a creation of the state. Even in child custody cases today, the state wasn't determining who the parent is. But now, under same-sex marriage, because parenthood is being redefined, the state will be forced to define what parent means. So when you have the unparent involved in the child custody, then it becomes, how many diapers did they change? How many bottles did they feed? Did the child call them mommy? Redefining marriage from the union of a man and a woman to the union of any two persons will alter three principles that we've always known to be true. Number one, children are entitled to a relationship with both parents. Number two, legal parenthood ordinarily tracks biological parentage. And third, the state recognizes parentage but does not assign it. All of those will no longer be true. The state will expand as well because it will need to suppress opposition. The doctor must perform reproductive technologies against his will. Catholic charities, such as in Boston, will no longer be able to do adoptions because they refuse to release the children to same-sex couples. The Archdiocese of Washington, D.C. will no longer offer spousal benefits because they've been forced to provide same-sex benefits. And right here in New Hampshire, the most recent challenge that we faced was CACR 17, which sought to put transsexual rights into our state's constitution. So I wish that I had time to share more of the arguments against same-sex marriage and why the problem with it redefining parenthood, but I don't have enough time for that. So at the end of the talk, I will actually have, Scott will be passing out an article on the libertarian case for man-woman marriage, and it goes into greater detail than what I have time here today. But just in conclusion, a couple of thoughts. So while in Rome last summer, I was with my family, and I was struck when I saw the Colosseum. We talked about the fall of Rome and with our 4 boys, and we reflected upon what took place in the Colosseum. I was struck at how easily our stadium at Foxborough or Fenway Park could become that light in the could become that very thing in light of the deterioration of the culture if we don't defend these 3 pillars of faith, life, and marriage. So I guess it comes down to this. Is our concern about immediate desires, or is it about preserving a civilization? Without children, a civilization cannot continue. If we are only living for the moment, leaving a legacy doesn't really matter then, does it? I don't want America to become like Rome. Our children deserve more, and our vets who risk their lives for our freedom deserve nothing less. Thank you.
Thank you, Shannon. And our third panelist is Charlie Arlinghaus. Since 2003, he has served as the president of the Josiah Bartlett Center, is New Hampshire's free market think tank. He writes a weekly column on public policy for the New Hampshire Union Leader. His policy research covers a broad range of state policy, including education, healthcare, and fiscal policy. He's been interviewed on public policy issues on major domestic networks and the 25 largest newspapers in the country and from media outlets on every continent except for Antarctica. He has degrees in American history from the College of William and Mary and the University of New Hampshire. Charlie?
Thanks for having me, and I want to thank you for that very generous introduction, and that'll seem very sincere to everybody in the audience who doesn't realize that I wrote it. I don't want to misrepresent who I am. I am the establishment guy on the panel here, but I work for a free market think tank. I do a ton of work with the Cato Institute. We bring people up from there to speak up here a lot. The guy who did education policy for us when we pushed the school choice law now works at the Cato Institute. So we're kind of establishment in a Cato-friendly kind of way. So just take that with a grain of salt. And I want to talk. I think there are a lot of areas where people disagree and people agree. And I think Ed wrote a terrific book that really helps frame this debate. And while I agree with a lot of what he says, I'm also not nearly as alarmist. And I will note the irony of I think everybody in this room is objectivist or to some extent libertarian, and we can't stand country club Republicans, yet of course the meeting is being held. Just a thought. And I hate country clubs as much as the next guy. I used to caddy at one, and I hated every single member who made a stupid one-iron joke. Even God can't hit a one-iron. That's why you hold it up in a lightning storm.
Yeah.
But that having been said, I think there's a in the American system we have two parties. We have two major parties. The alternative to that is that one of the parties goes away or is gradually replaced by another one. And that occasionally happens, but it's very unlikely to happen. And it's very unlikely to happen, I think, because to some extent the Republican Party, as dysfunctional and stupid as it is, and it is a dysfunctional party, and my friends call it the stupid party, and I think quite accurately, and I used to work for it at one point in my life, which I largely regret. But it is, generally speaking, a useful coalition of people who think in a relatively like-minded, broadly way. One of the two parties is going to be, generally speaking, right of center. The other is going to be, generally speaking, left of center. The question is, can people who are right of center of differing opinions coexist? To some extent, they can, and to some extent, they can't. There are always going to be some issues on which people have fundamental disagreements, and those fundamental disagreements cannot be resolved. The question is that fundamental disagreement going to destroy the structure or broad coalition that advances other things? I agree that a lot of people, particularly in Washington, are incapable of operating in an efficient manner. My sense, though, is that it's less because you can group them neatly into three parcels than that everybody crosses lines between those parcels. They like some parts of what those parcels believe and not others. Even within objectivism, for example, there are schisms, right? There's and I don't know if it's West Coast, East Coast like it is with the Straussians, but there's an element of that. And within libertarian policy, I sat at a very nice drink in a bar with a guy who was explaining to me how the Cato Institute is a bunch of establishment neocon sellouts who are bent on destroying the world, and that only Murray Rothbard is right. And he was very sincere, and he made a really good point for his cause. I witnessed an argument between a guy from Cato and Heritage. But frankly, the guy at Cato won because they said, "What are you winning on?" And the guy from Cato said, "What you mean? Did Mitt Romney pass our health care plan? No." And but broadly speaking, I think to the extent that there's a civil war, it's not a civil war. It's an argument within a party where people can, broadly speaking, agree. Probably everybody on this panel, although we disagree fundamentally on some things, are probably leaning toward voting for a very similar candidate. Everybody in this room who's from New Hampshire are leaning toward voting probably all for Jim Rubens in the Senate race. And then you're quite welcome. But in broad coalitions, we kind of like the same people, but we disagree with them on some issues. And so I don't want to make too much of a point of that. Even this agreement between Eric Cantor, who used to be a conservative, but like every idiot who goes to Washington became enamored of the city and had his victory party, which turned out to be poorly named, in D.C. instead of in the district he lives in. Richmond is apparently so far from D.C. that he couldn't get home very often. And things like that happen. I think that what's happening is on so many issues, people are winning. Frankly, if I'm the establishment, we're winning. But I know that that's not true. We are losing on some issues without question, and there are people who are very bad tacticians and very bad strategists who make very bad decisions. We see that in our own state. Recently, in a debate that we lost, although having won the debate on some level, the people who were in charge decided to do something stupid on a big issue about expanding the welfare state. But I think there are broad cross lines, and although we may disagree on some issues, I think that people can look at the Republican Party who are pro-life and pro-choice and agree that, broadly speaking, it can move the political culture in a more freedom-oriented direction, that can happen. I saw Harry Brown speak once when he was running. This is probably in 2000, I guess. I don't remember. He ran twice, and I don't remember which 2 years. And somebody asked him that fundamental question. You're a libertarian. You say people of the right can all support you. How do you square that circle with in what the dominant organization was at that time, the Christian Coalition? And he said, I don't have a problem. He said, the Christian Coalition and I agree on almost everything. And here's why. We agree that the government should not dictate what we tell our children. We agree that we should educate our children however we want to. We agree that the government should be moved further and further away from these decisions and not interfere with us. And I would say to them, and they would say to him, he made a really good case. Frankly, he made a better case for the Christian Coalition than its leadership at the time was capable of making. And if you've ever heard Ralph Reed talk, you know what I'm talking about. And a case for why there is a huge commonality of interest. I think Shannon makes the case that on some issues there's no commonality of interest, and but you don't have to agree with everything Shannon thinks. You don't have to agree with everything I think. You don't have to agree with everything any one of us thinks to agree that, broadly speaking, we're probably going to be part of a coalition that does believe, largely, that the government and whatever intrusive role it has should be lessened. We may disagree about the extent it should be lessened. We may disagree about how to get there. We may be equally frustrated by the fact that there are stupid people leading our party who make stupid tactical decisions and are generally morons but somehow manage to get elected anyway. In fact, I think in that case, 80% of the American public agrees with us. We're governed by morons and we deserve what we can get. But I think that broadly speaking, we can also agree that things are a lot better than they were. There are ideas that are on the table these days that were never on the table before. The notion of repealing regulations. Things happen in my own state, for example. We cut the government's budget 10%, an actual honest-to-God cut. It was 90% of what it had been before. It's something that had never happened in the post-World War II era. And it was sort of the default position, partly because the election went real well, and a bunch of people got elected, and that included some establishment Republicans, some social conservative Republicans, and some libertarian Republicans. And they disagreed on a lot of stuff internally, but they agreed on a lot of stuff internally. And they had some of those fights, and some sides won and some sides lost. But broadly speaking, the thing they agreed on and the thing that we come back to is that whatever the government does, they should do less of. And whatever the government does, they're probably going to do poorly, and they should roll back. And whatever the government does in our lives, they should probably not tell us what to do. And broadly speaking, that's true. But there are going to be issues we're going to disagree on, and it's easy to focus on things like the guy who wants to put the Ten Commandments in his courtroom, or some idiot who wants to talk about anti-sodomy laws, or some other stupid thing like that. But broadly speaking, the big issues that are at the center of the table are going to be issues where we can build broad coalitions.
All right, Charlie, thank you. So with our time being short here, we won't have a lot of time for questions. So if you want to get a question, and I need you to come on up and stand by the microphone. Panel, I'm going to ask you to try to keep your responses to a minute to 30 seconds. I know that's tough to do. We'll try to squeeze in as many as we can. And while folks are getting lined up here, if they do, I want to start out with a question. So generally speaking, I agree with a lot of what you all were saying about freedom, but generally speaking, the Republican Party is not increasing freedom around the country. I mean, if you look at a lot of the policies that are happening in terms of Common Core adoption across the board in states, regulation across the board in states, cronyism as it continues to develop, even Medicaid expansion across the nation, the Republican Party does not seem to be the party that is shrinking the size of government, broadly speaking. Your responses?
Yeah. I'll respond and say that I agree with your premise that that you're seeing Republicans on many fronts losing. You also, by the way, see victories as well. I mean, you've had a number of them up in Wisconsin, just to give one example. But what I'm saying politically is, and maybe I'm echoing what we heard from Charlie, is that if the GOP wants to win in the future, and if freedom wants to win in the future, we have to get behind the freedom agenda. Yes, there are some fundamental disagreements on this panel that we're not, I'm not going to, brush over them. But that's why I say establishment Republicans have to focus on this is why we need to change the system, and social conservatives need to do the same. I know that they're very passionate about abortion, but it's not going to disappear anytime soon legally, and the situation is going to be worse, especially for education, if the Republicans continue this way. And if it continues this way, young people are much more socially liberal, and they're going to continue to vote Democrat. There are a bunch of new wealth-creating entrepreneurs who generally like free markets, who love their work, who are wealth creators, who are not going to come to the GOP because they don't like the people who are going out after sodomy and things like that. That's the political reality. So that's what we have to do: get behind freedom.
Other thoughts on that?
I just want to follow up on the point with Common Core, too. I think that there's a unique opportunity with Common Core to bring other people into our party, because we've seen in other parts of the country, such as in New York, where these teachers' unions have, created an outrage over what's happening there with Common Core because of the testing. They were kind of the guinea pigs in the country, and so they've already gone through the testing, and they see the negative ramifications of it. And we've seen it in certain towns here in New Hampshire, such as in Manchester and Alton. And so I think that the Republican Party has a unique opportunity to gain some new folks into our party, into our tent, because they're starting to see that Republicans want parents to make that decision. We want teachers to be able to teach in the classroom, to use their creativity in the classroom, whereas these kinds of policies are actually not allowing them to do so. So I think it would be smart for the party to seize those opportunities on that particular issue.
Definitely.
I think for every regulatory loss you can point to, and Medicaid expansion is the most pathetic of them, and which is frankly governed by people's inability to resist the temptation of the federal government waving money in their face, which is something that crosses a lot of lines. And crony capitalism is always an issue, because you don't think crony capitalism is a good idea unless there happens to be an auto dealer who lives in your district. The notion of free staters voting for an auto dealer bill of rights because they're good people and they're local. There's an issue there, but there are those temptations, but there are also little victory after little victory after little victory. There are things being added to the agenda that weren't added to the agenda. I would just add on Common Core. I think Common Core, it's easy for people to see we don't want the federal government writing our regulations. Often that debate gets bogged down in the minutia of things that aren't central to Common Core, but is some bureaucrat's stupid response to Common Core, which he claims was the name of Common Core. And to me, the broader thing that will unite people is an educational freedom agenda, which includes charter schools, but more fundamentally involves a school choice where schools are decentralized to the extent that it's a parental option as opposed to a state option.
Yeah, I'd abolish government schools altogether.
That's a whole other panel, right? All right, sir, your question.
Yeah, it's basically some observation. Number one is in terms of the free trade concept. What we all fail to understand is that economics 001 would be if there are three people, one person has $3 and the other two have none, that if we do transactions, i.e. free trade, and I give my dollar to the other two people, by definition, their standard of living goes up, my standard of living goes down. So I think in terms of free trade, in those broad concepts, I think a fresh stand back, take a look at an approach is really required, because we can argue and talk all day long and not solve any problems, but I think we have to step back and look at the very basics, then dig in. Secondly, as it relates to that, is my current understanding is that our current national debt is, with funded and unfunded liabilities, is $60 trillion. And a good friend of mine told me, Jim, I think people like to ignore debt. And the fascinating thing about a $60 trillion debt, to put it into normal human terms, if I were to spend $81 million since the day Christ was born, to this day I would not have spent $60 trillion. So I think we also have to look at, where it is that we're going. It's great to have all these really keen esoteric discussions, but at the end of the day, we have to step back and look at the basics.
Absolutely. Thank you for that. Appreciate it. And we'll try to keep the question short. Let me just ask the panel, though, on that point. So the Republican Party, we're talking about demographics. One thing media is never going to tell you is that right now in this country, almost 50% of the American electorate is no longer affiliated Republican or Democratic.
Yep, okay? Independent.
So so you're losing generationally. A lot of those are millennials.
Yep.
So when we talk about things like the national debt, that's their money, right? And that's the money not just of millennials, but of their children and now their children's children. How do you become a party of the future if what you're actually doing is indebting the future? And it's obviously not just Republicans doing it, but Republicans talk about free market and fiscal sanity, and yet the policies seem to be insane.
Yep.
Quick
Agreed.
responses.
Agreed. I mean, borrowing 40 cents of every dollar you spend is almost criminal negligence, and I would probably say maybe prison and re-education camps for the members of Congress, but we can have another panel on that later.
If you, I think there are ways to look at this as an opportunity for because we know what we believe and what we want to have happen. And sometimes it's hard to scare people. And it was hard to scare people about debt, and and George Bush and Barack Obama are equally as bad on this, which scares people. But it's hard to scare them on the debt when nothing happens. But when the things that were happening in Europe, like Greece, happen, and then you tell them that our current total debt, as opposed to public debt, but includes the amount of money the government owes itself, is roughly 102% of our economy. Public debt maybe only be 75, but it's 102%, and that's Greek territory. It does scare people. It does have an intergenerational thing where kids do get the concept that their parents are borrowing their money to pay for things they want today. And I think with young people, and let's be honest, young people's demographics change. That most of us aren't voting the same way we voted when we were young. I happen to be because I was weird. But when I was in college, everybody in college was a Republican, and those people do not vote Republican to the same extent that they do now. Yep. And these people aren't as well. Your position changes when you look at your pay stub, and you're like, what the hell? Where'd all my money go? Yep. And but we can use that as an argument to say, part of it is that let's keep in mind that all of us in this room are weirdos. And we're freaks. First of all, you're in a room on a nice day listening to people talk about god-awful, boring things, and most normal humans aren't like that. They're playing golf, or they're working, or they're doing something else, and they tune in tangentially. And we need to find the things that take that tangential, very slight interest and bring it in. And this is one thing that can do that.
I think that it's difficult for millennials to grasp the consequences of the national debt, because even in their own lives, as they're facing their college loans or whatnot, the sky hasn't fallen in. Like, they kick the can, we have to change our culture with those millennials in the way that we're handling their education and so forth, because it just isn't reality to them.
Yep. Yeah, absolutely. Okay, at risk of getting in trouble with the folks here, and I'm sure I will, so I'll just risk it. We'll try to do these really quick, just a couple more questions. Quick question and then very quick answers, okay? Go ahead, sir.
I have great difficulty understanding how pro-lifers can advocate individual liberty. The woman is pregnant, as an example. I know this is a third rail issue. The woman is pregnant, and she should have control over her fetus, no matter what. And yet, government is tagged to step in and say, well, the fetus has rights as a citizen before they're born. And my stand is that the cleanest and most objective way of looking at it, rather than getting tangled all in the emotions, is to say when the fetus delivers and they're on their own, then they achieve individual rights.
Okay, Shannon, let's let you do that one real quick.
So when does it become separate from the mother? Is it when their legs are out, their head is out, or all of the above? Is it when the umbilical cord has been cut? What if the child needs help being able to breathe?
No, I'm not. You're bringing emotional arguments now.
Well, no, I think she's asking about the technical side of it.
Yeah,
when
it's
it has delivered, when the cord
David, we have to have
when the cord is cut.
When the cord is cut. So what happens then if the child can't breathe on its own? Because, for example, a professor at Princeton supports the idea of infanticide up to 6 months, because the child may need help being breathed, to be able to breathe or whatnot. So where does one draw the line? What in the case of if the child is at 20 weeks and born prematurely, is that life worthy of being, saved and whatnot? I'm not being emotional here. I'm being technical and trying to pin down exactly when suddenly the star lights up and a life is there worthy of protection. We start to walk on very shaky ground when we start to determine when that life begins like that.
Great. And we'll let you guys have more of a debate afterwards. I'm sure there'll be one. Okay, quickly.
Will the GOP ever reduce government until they challenge the basic assumptions, the altruist collectivist assumptions? For example, 3 conservative Republicans in Texas all agreed we ought to provide health care for the poor. Well, but then the only question is, well, what's the definition of poor? They were fighting Obamacare. So unless they challenge I want to ask you a question, unless they challenge the basic premises that the government shouldn't be doing it at all, do you think they will ever succeed?
I think that there is a process by which you challenge these things and by which you change the ideas in the culture. And we start by doing it in things like this, but it has to get out there, and it's got to be over time, but you have to start somewhere. So, yeah, it's got to be challenged.
I agree with you on the moment of birth. It brings up too many borderline, sideline issues. So I think 4 months would be fine for the last abortion, just to get rid of all those borderline issues. I wanted to ask something about responsibility. You said when two people take an action to have a child, they have to take responsibility for their actions. So if you have sex and you didn't intend to have a child, but it comes along, you have to take responsibility. It's a non sequitur to say that responsibility is to have the child and raise the fetus. It's also responsible to have an abortion. You said you got to take responsibility, take action. It's a non sequitur to say the only action is to go ahead with the pregnancy and the birth. Non sequitur.
More of a statement, but okay. Last one, here we go.
Heather Wagenhals. So the Republican Party added pro-life to its platform. It was not part of its original platform many years ago. And if folks, this is what I'm having trouble understanding. If you do believe in God, then you have to believe that God gave us free will. And in China, they used to make women get abortions without choice.
They still
and
do.
The point of free will is to be able to choose. And your ramifications have to do with the maker upstairs and not a government body. And I don't know how regulating marriage and regulating abortions limits government and furthers freedom. So can you help me understand that?
Well, it's because it is an individual human life. Where does one draw the line? You can say,
but in the Old Testament, you're not alive until you get your soul from the guff, and that doesn't happen until you're born.
I'm not making a religious argument at all in this case. I believe that it is an individual human being worthy of protection, and that alone is the most basic job of the government, is to provide the right to life. Thomas Jefferson put that first, because no other rights matter without the right to life.
That it's in direct conflict to being able to choose what you do.
Well, you can apply that to a whole host of issues within our culture then. I should be able to choose
but a fetus can't
to
go
take
out and get a job.
I
They
can
can't go out and
choose
support
to take
themselves.
his
They can't
phone.
contribute to
It's a
society.
great debate. It
They're
really
not
is.
legal enough to vote, so how are they entitled to rights?
Yeah, it's a great debate, and obviously it goes beyond this. We're actually low on time, but I
Thank you very much.
I thank you very much for your question, and I thank the panel. Would you agree with me? The panel has been terrific, and appreciate your time this afternoon. It is the fight between that libertarian wing and social conservative wing that ultimately is the new Republican Party. I don't know what that's going to be when it's all said and done. I don't think any of us do, but that's what it's going to be. So figuring that out between you two, I'm sorry to the establishment guy at the end, though I will give him a quick shout out. Anybody who mentions the West Coast, East Coast schism, I assumed you were talking about gangster rap. In the beginning, Biggie Smalls, and that's what I thought it was. But no one in here knows what I'm talking about, so we'll just say that. Thank you guys very much. Enjoy the rest of your afternoon as you head to your next sessions. Thank you.